Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. The origins of what we talk about here on Security Breach can go back to any number of transformational events. Some might point to the first worm that was released on Cornell University in 1989. Others point to the introduction of Stuxnet in 2010. I personally feel the modern age of OT security was turned on its head with the 2021 Colonial Pipeline attack. The reality is that all of these events, and many others, each contributed an individual component to the unique mosaic that is the legacy of industrial cybersecurity. What's most interesting is that going back to even before Stuxnet, the first hacks of industrial control systems occurred at water treatment facilities, oil and gas pipelines, and energy plants. These targets were chosen because they simultaneously provided great visibility, heightened social impact, and most notably, easily exploitable vulnerabilities. In most cases, these attacks allowed the hackers to accomplish all of their early financial and self-promotional goals, along with longer-term benefits that we're all dealing with now, namely how to successfully probe the ICS. Hackers are learning more and more about the OT landscape all the time, including the opportunities that lie in shutting down critical production networks to extort manufacturers and their supply chains. It's the same game they've previously played in ransoming and shutting down utilities, hospitals, and financial institutions. Our guest for today's episode has seen hackers apply these lessons learned about the industrial control system firsthand and has some interesting thoughts on the current threat landscape as well as solutions for keeping your systems secure. It's my pleasure to welcome John Cusimano, VP of OT Security for Amexa, a leading provider of OT cybersecurity solutions. John, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time and welcome to Security Breach.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Glad to be here.
Awesome. There's a lot of different stuff we can talk to, and I know that Amexa gets into a lot of different areas for OT cybersecurity. But one of the things that's getting a lot of conversation right now as OT cybersecurity specialists start digging into things is this whole topic around risk assessment and threat risk assessment. It's a big conversation. It's a very complex target just due to the expanding attack surface, the added complexity of a lot of the bad actors out there. So maybe you can just kind of give us some thoughts there on, I guess, where do you start? It can be kind of a daunting task, but where would you recommend folks start on that?
Yeah, I've spent about the last 15 years of my career focused in this area, particularly OT cybersecurity risk assessment, because I came from a background of process and functional safety and automation prior to that, which is, I would say, generally speaking, is more mature discipline around risk assessment, risk management, around safety, right? We've had these systems in place for years and methodologies. So I tried to bring a lot of that into the cybersecurity, OT cybersecurity world when I got involved in this space. And so your question about where do you start? Well, I would say the first thing is pick a methodology, and how are you going to risk assess so that you're doing it consistently, you're getting the same results from site to site or system to system. There's a lot of good guidance over the last 10, 15 years coming out of standards bodies. One of them I worked very closely on, the ISA, International Society of Automation, 62443 series of standards. We wrote a very specific subpart of that called 3-2, 62443 3-2, which is Security Risk Assessment for Design is the name of the standard. And it walks through at a very high level a methodology for assessing OT or ICS cybersecurity risk in a manner that is consistent with leveraged existing standards from NIST and other organizations. So not trying to reinvent the wheel, but trying to apply best practice information security risk models and safety, combining those into kind of a cyber physical approach to cyber risk management for OT and IoT.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense starting there. And I kind of want to dig into your background a little bit. That's kind of interesting because I think there's a lot of people in our audience who have some similar experiences, or as we get into this more deeply, there's a lot of openings, a lot of opportunities within OT cybersecurity. So how did you kind of go from the safety side to the cybersecurity? I mean, they seem like parallels for sure, but maybe you could talk a little bit about your journey there.
Yeah, sure. So I've been an automation engineer my whole career. So I started out working in a plant, or actually for a company that operated many plants in chemicals, and was programming PLCs and DCS systems, and I loved that. It was a lot of fun. But I moved. I had an opportunity to move to as I moved it to a vendor type of role. We manufactured safety instrumented systems, or safety systems, as well as DCS systems. So I learned all about process safety, functional safety, and how critical it is that these control systems that are programmable, electronic, and then open to suspect to all those failures, how critical it is in certain environments that these systems, that they're reliable and repeatable, and if they fail, they must fail in a safe manner, in a predictable, safe manner. And that can be sometimes tricky with software and electronics, but there are techniques to do that. And so I got so I had an opportunity to move from there to into a small consulting, boutique consulting company that did primary business was around safety, industrial safety and safety instrumented systems. But they had the foresight to start an industrial cybersecurity practice, which they asked me to lead. And so that's really when I made that transition about 15 years ago. And like I said, you kind of bring what you know. So I was relatively, I mean, industrial cybersecurity was pretty new 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So there wasn't so I drew from my safety background, and I'm not unique. Many people, when you look at OT cybersecurity, what you're talking about are cyber physical systems that if they are compromised can result in physical harm to people, to the environment, and also financial harm, of course, to companies.
No, it makes a lot of sense. It's just it's interesting because we do, again, talk about the kind of the lack of expertise when it comes to OC security. So it's always interesting to see how people got there, maybe providing some insight as to how organizations can identify those folks and grow them into these roles. In your experience, too, what have you seen as some of the bigger areas of risk? I know you talked about the methodology in terms of a great place to start, but as things have evolved, are those greater threats coming from vulnerabilities we uncover in the ICS? Is it the human element within? Is it the bad actors outside of the organization? I mean, it's a combination of all those things, I guess, but is there an area in particular that you see is really coming to the forefront right now?
Yeah. So it's interesting because we do. I lead and facilitate, and I've been doing this for 15 years, as I said. And that's a lot of the work we do at RMX is around that. And so we see all kinds of different systems when we assess and remediate them. So there's always the typical. There's like the top down, the threats coming from IT into OT, coming through the enterprise. And that could be your ransomware. That could be people, hackers misusing remote access. It could be targeted malware making its way in, and that, of course, we have a lot of protections there. And I'll get into some of the other issues around that. But then, when you're talking about industrial facilities, particularly when you move from, like, you have manufacturing sites and plants and factories that are relatively self-contained. But you also have industrial applications. We have pipelines and electrical, power distribution, and maritime shipping applications, and ports and terminals. We have these facilities that are very geographically spread out, where the network could be going hundreds of miles through all kinds of terrain and all kinds of different terminals and stations. In the case of pipelines and things along that. And those are all access points because the SCADA network, OT network, SCADA network, PCN network, whatever you want to call it, and particularly in those cases, is traveling it has a very large physical footprint, that which means that there are access points. And that also is true in the plant. So you want to make sure that not only are you protecting top down, but there are threats and threat actors and vulnerabilities out in the field, all the way down in the Purdue model down to level 0, level 1, where in many cases those kind of systems, would be like a small PLC on a remote valve in the middle of a field somewhere, that if somebody were to gain access to that, they are on the OT network. And we've even seen some things where not only, yes, they could come in, jump a fence, plug in a laptop, and they're on the OT network. But in the case, more and more, you're seeing cellular technology being used, particularly for those remote applications where you may have a cell modem in the cabinet. And if somebody were to gain access to that cabinet, they can take that cell modem home. And the cell modem is provisioned on the wireless network, on the cellular network, and they can plug their laptop in from the comfort of their home and be on the SCADA network.
Boy, I mean, your mind can kind of go in a lot of different places as far how dangerous that could be, how disastrous that could be for the enterprise, or you're mentioning a lot of utilities as well, and we've seen that in recent months as well, some of those types of attacks. So when we look at some of these different vulnerabilities that are surfacing right now, you just talked about a lot of endpoint stuff. We've also seen a lot of just things as the attack surface broadens, we have a hard time keeping track of all these endpoints. What do you think are some of the things that you've seen that have worked well in terms of trying to secure those, whether it's the connection to legacy networking or legacy connections to older equipment, bringing on these new technologies, or just the fact that we have more endpoints collecting data?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that work really well. Kind of going back to the ISA 62443 standard, I think that was really the first time that the concept of zones and conduits was documented. So
Sure.
that whole idea of taking your control system architecture and partitioning it, not just into the Purdue hierarchy, which is important, but also within the Purdue hierarchy, creating security zones and segmenting the OT networks by function. So if this device over here doesn't need to talk to this one over here, particularly the kind of the east-west traffic, then partition that. There's no reason, but I've certainly seen this. I've been, going back to pipelines, doing assessments where we go to multiple sites along the pipeline, and I can be at one location, and we even proved out, like I can ping any device anywhere at any of the facilities because basically a flat network below the firewall. So zones and conduits is a great way to break down and only allow those devices that need to talk to each other to talk to each other. So that's one. There's a lot of other things around endpoint. The technology that's come out just in the last 5 to 10 years has been tremendous, from the detection solutions that monitor OT networks and are protocol aware, so they can actually discern what is happening on the networks. To 10 years ago, you didn't see a lot of EDR solutions on OT assets. People were afraid of putting antivirus on OT machines and application safe listing. But now that is becoming much, much more common and quite effective now, but particularly the modern EDR solutions that are much lighter weight. And application safe listing works so well in an OT environment because things don't change. Users aren't installing applications on a regular basis. Things should be pretty static, and so using ASL to lock them down makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, talking about working with IT, and we know we can't just cut and paste a lot of those approaches over to the OT environment. You being an automation engineer kind of from the start, How have you seen that relationship with the IT guys sort of evolve over time? I'm sure there was some headbutting that went on at some point. Hopefully we've minimized that a little bit now, but I think it still goes on in a lot of organizations. Or what are you seeing there in terms of those two entities sort of working together now?
Yeah, it certainly has changed a lot over the years. And we are definitely seeing, we talk about the convergence of IT and OT, and we see that not only in the technology, but also in personnel.
Yeah.
There's a convergence and a better understanding. OT and IT seem to have a better understanding of each other than they did years ago. It does vary quite a bit by company. You'll see, some that are very, very cooperative and proactive, and some that there's still tension for sure. And it's usually due to not understanding each other's environments and particularly the nuances of an operational environment and the things that are critical in the OT environment, such as safety risk, of course, and operational production demands, not being able to reboot a computer that's running a facility, for example. So there's those kind of operational differences. So even though the technology's oftentimes very similar, the operational requirements in OT are very different. So if IT and OT don't understand those differences, they sometimes struggle. That's a lot of times where we come in as advisors when we're helping both assess and remediate risk. Is our team at our MEXA has people that many people that have served in industrial IT roles in facilities in their past, or in OT roles, or automation engineers or field engineers. So having that experience, being able to talk to both sides and help bridge the gap definitely is helpful. And we also find that the methodology that we particularly subscribe to around OT risk assessments, it goes by a few different names: Cyber PHA, Cyber HAZOP, based on that standard that I mentioned, Cyber Bowtie. Those types of workshop-based assessments, where we sit down with people that have expertise and talk about, I guess what they all have in common is they're all consequence-based. So you start by saying, what would happen if an attacker or malware or ransomware got into this system or into this zone in this system? What would happen? What are the consequences? And not we try to drive down to the actual operational consequence. So the first reaction may be, well, the operator may lose visibility. They might not be able to trust what they're seeing on their HMI, or the values could be, if screen could go blank, for example. But we try to drive a little further. So what? What does that mean if the operator? In some cases, it means we must immediately go hit an e-stop because we're blind and we have to shut down for safety reasons. In other applications, we'll be all right. Get some people on radios. We go out and we'll operate manual like we used to. So it depends on the application what the answer to that is. So we try to drive to the actual consequence, and really only the people that operate the facility can answer those questions on a day-to-day basis. Like, what would happen if? And experienced operators can tell you exactly what they would do, because they probably experienced that, maybe not intentional, but they may have experienced that scenario due to some other cause.
Yeah. Well, that would seem like the very foundation of risk assessment, right? Trying to understand what if, and then prioritizing off of that. And I think that's a really important point, because again, I think there's the potential for a lot of these elements of cybersecurity in the OT environment to become very overwhelming. People see so many different endpoints, so much different inventory to secure, that they don't know where to start. So at least getting that foundation in place is a great point. Another thing, John, talking a little bit more about segmentation. I'm thinking about a couple of recent attacks that we saw. We saw a semiconductor company that was recently hit by Dark Angel. Same ransomware group also hit Johnson Controls earlier, that was late last year. And in both cases, they used an IT endpoint, or an IT entrance, I guess you could say, to get in and go throughout the organization. In that case, Was now the segmentation helped in some ways because it warded off in some respects, but maybe it didn't go far enough. Are you seeing a need right now for OT organizations to kind of evolve their segmentation strategies a little bit more, or is it just being more thorough on the endpoints?
We're definitely seeing that. People call it microsegmentation. We're definitely seeing that. In fact, not only in the layer 3 and below, where we're seeing better segmentation at those levels in the architecture. I said, a good example would be, level 1 is typically all your control and all your controllers, and so you could take a refinery. You may have hundreds of controllers in a refinery, but they're operating different units. So you have the crude unit, you have the alky unit, you have the cat cracker. And typically speaking, those PLCs don't need to talk to each other unit to unit. Or if they do, they're going to go up and over. So up to some more supervisory system that may pass some information back and forth. Like there could be exceptions to that. But so that's that idea of, okay, you don't want to just have everything at level 1. You want to segment by unit operation. And then within that unit operation, or in a factory, it might be a cell or a product line in a factory. First you want to break down by function. Then you take that function, you want to even break it down further. Well, let's separate our safety systems from our basic process control systems, for example. So the other place that we're seeing that is in the DMZ. So DMZs have gone from being originally, the concept of a DMZ was to allow communications from the OT system, usually operational information, to go up into MES and ERP systems. So you had that boardroom to shop floor connectivity that people wanted. They've evolved into, so usually there was just maybe a jump server in there. There was file servers, but there wasn't a lot in the DMZ. Now we work on systems where there could be 20, 30 different servers in a DMZ, and a lot of them are security servers. So we've added a lot of functionality, a lot of security technology to sit on top of our ICS systems, whether that's Active Directory, patch management, backup, antivirus, application safe listing, all these security services that have been stacked on top of our control systems that are trusted. They're trusted systems to talk to the OT environment, as well as many of them also go up and out to get patches and updates. So that's added a ton of complexity sitting on top of our OT systems that used to be, years ago, they were isolated, air-gapped. Yeah. Now they're connected, and we added all this security technology to secure them, but those also introduce vulnerabilities. Now you've got a much bigger attack surface. You've got all this complexity. So we are seeing microsegmentation within the DMZ. So instead of putting all these servers in a flat DMZ, we're seeing either multiple DMZs or segmented DMZs, because some things are for security, some are for communications, some are for reporting.
No, really interesting when you start getting into the microsegmentation. I think a lot of people always, the response we always get there is, how do I find the time, to implement all these segmentation strategies? And the response is, better to take the time now than have to deal with the response element of it later in terms of what can happen. And those recent attacks we talked about are good examples of it.
Yep.
So talking, one of the things you mentioned there was a trusted application layer. And we've seen a lot of these trusted applications. If you're talking about somebody like a Microsoft or a Cisco, they've got issues too at times. They'll have vulnerabilities that are coming to the forefront. And that brings up a concern about patching. As you know, as well as anybody, patching in the industrial environment is tough because you're looking at potentially a downtime. How would you offer in terms of maybe best practices or strategies to assess some of the patching needs that industrial organizations may have while also managing some of the downtime that's inevitably going to be associated with them?
Yeah, patch management's a tough problem in the OT environment, because one thing that people have to remember is, there's a lot of pressure, but particularly, in the IT environment, there's a ton of pressure. You patch, the faster you can patch, the better. Organizations are measured on how quickly they patch. You try to translate that into the OT environment, and there's a lot of challenges, right?
Yeah.
Because patches are changes, and we should have tight change management controls in the OT environment. We do typically have tight change managements, but sometimes people forget that a patch is a change, a security update is a change, especially in validated environments like in pharmaceuticals, FDA validated environments, where every change has to be documented in detail.
Yeah.
That those are changes, and so you need to manage them as changes. And like you said, especially with all the supply chain concerns today, the last thing you want to do is rush a patch out and find out after the fact that it was a bad patch or it caused problems.
Yeah.
So you got this balancing act between patch as fast as you can, and every patch patching is a risky
Yeah.
process, and so you have to balance those two. So there's I don't want to go off on a big tangent, but we myself and many of my colleagues have been working on we call it vulnerability rationalization, which is borrowing from alarm rationalization in process control systems. So the idea that many years ago, organizations realized that as we moved into digital systems and DCS systems and PLC-based systems, that alarms we were developing way too many alarms because it was easy. It used to be you had to like actually hardwire an alarm to a panel, and you only had so much real estate, so you had to be kind of picky. But alarms became free. So you started adding alarms, and then you got into these situations where you would have alarm floods. When something happened in the plant, the operatives would just be inundated. Their screen would fill up with alarms. They didn't know which ones to respond to first. Actually started lots of investigations by regulators because some incidents in the investigation were found that the alarm floods were really prevented the operators from making good decisions and responding properly. So we took that concept of alarm rationalization, which again is kind of a mature discipline around prioritizing and ranking alarms, and took that to vulnerabilities. We have the same problem now, particularly now in ICS, where we've deployed vulnerability detection systems, or ICS detection systems, anomaly detection system, whatever you want to call them. These systems that now have the ability to go out and discover the vulnerabilities that were always there. We just didn't have them documented before. They discover all the vulnerabilities in the endpoints in the networks and the traffic, and raise alarms effectively. And then we tend to ship them off to the SOC and hope that they can do something with them. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, the SOC operators aren't really going to understand OT alarms and alerts, but also there's just too many. It's not manageable.
Yeah. So
we have to basically apply that same concept of alarm rationalization to vulnerability rationalization, and be able to take what could be thousands of vulnerabilities that are discovered by these tools and discern them down to which are the ones that really matter, which are the ones that if I don't address this vulnerability, I have a huge risk exposure, and which ones, it could be a CVE on a PLC or a application. So it might be a 10, right? CVE score, and you be like, oh my God, we got to do something about this right away. Well, it depends on the application whether that 10 is a 10 to you.
Yep.
Because when they're scored for all applications. When you're scoring a CVE, you don't know how the system's going to be used. You know if it's going to be connected to the internet. So it's actually already built into the CVE scoring system. There's this whole environmental factor and temporal score that a lot of people don't use. They just use the base score. It's a base score of 10. So we took that, we kind of applied that, tweaked it a little bit for OT, but we have this developed this methodology which we can rationalize vulnerabilities to really have only the high risk ones rise to the top.
Yeah.
Um, it's a little tricky, but with some tooling and some process and leveraging um, some things from safety and alarm rationalization, came up with a technique to do that. And then there's some plenty of nice tools out there you can use. So once you establish the model, new vulnerabilities can be automatically rationalized. You just have to kind of calibrate your model.
Yeah. Well, John, I think that's huge on a couple. I'm glad you went off on the tangent there a little bit because, first of all, when we talk about alarm rationalization, it becomes more of a focus on shutting off the alarm as opposed to figuring out what's actually wrong. I mean, that's just human nature, and that
Right. You
happens on the
just
plant
shelf it or
floor.
silence it. Yeah.
Yeah, that happens on the plant floor all the time. And I think this ability to prioritize those vulnerabilities per the application, per the enterprise, per what's going on that plant floor is huge because as we've been talking about, you just get flooded with all of these different things that you can try to address from a security perspective. To have a tool that prioritizes them, I think that's a huge win for everyone in the OT environment. John, those are some really interesting points. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about Armexa and some of the stuff you guys are up to.
Yep, absolutely. So Armexa is a relatively young company, but we're staffed with people that have been doing this for a long time. So we describe ourselves as cybersecurity advisors, practitioners, and though I don't like the term managed services providers.
Okay.
So we wear different hats, in other words. So in some ways, we're like a consultant. And some of us, myself included, came from spent a couple of years in the big consulting environment. Uh, and then a lot of people with practical hands-on field experience and actually remediating vulnerabilities, and then the managed service portion of that would be the kind of the continuous support for clients. But everything we do is OT, cybersecurity, and as I said, it's really been a collection we've been building a team of people with really rich experience in OT, ICS, OT, industrial IT, process control, process safety, cyber, and people that really just love what we do. And I think one thing we all do have in common is um, the big consulting environment wasn't right for us. Culturally, we prefer this kind of smaller, more nimble environment, more customer focused. Try to bring more value to our clients because in many cases we've been in their shoes. We've all, I think it's fair to say we've all worked in the field, so we know kind of firsthand the pains of being an asset owner.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great practical experience to share and pass along. You talked a lot about people there and building the company and the right people. People within a manufacturing enterprise, obviously essential, critically important. But as we're finding out, also a potential vulnerability if they're not really trained the right way or brought up to speed on some of the cybersecurity concerns within an organization. So when we look at the people factor of OT cybersecurity, what are some of the things that you've seen in terms of, again, maybe some best practices or things that have worked or things to avoid that you've seen not work?
Yep. Well, it is, in many ways, it's all about people, right?
Yeah.
Because, we always talk about people, process, and technology. Well, two out of three of those directly involve people, and processes. And then technology, of course, it's all technology developed by people. So really, in all cases, they all apply. So, and of course, humans aren't perfect, and neither is the technology they develop. So we found kind of keys to success around really standing up a program, because if you're serious about managing OT cybersecurity, you really need a program, not just a project. Sometimes some companies think, well, I can just do a project, we'll get everything secure, and then we're done. Or we'll buy some technology, we'll deploy that, and that's our program. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you really need a documented program. I keep going back to safety, but there's a lot of things that safety has done correctly or has done well. When we talk about building a safety culture within a manufacturing environment, I'd say really all manufacturing companies have safety programs, just personnel safety programs that are pretty mature. and they've developed a culture of safety. When you hold a handrail when you walk down the stairs.
Yeah.
You wear a hard hat. You wear your safety glasses. That's just cultural now. Um, so same way, borrowing from that. So a documented program where you have written policies, standards, procedures that get rolled out to the organization through some kind of training and awareness program, typically role based. Um, verification and validation of things that are critical, that are human based operations, trying to do as much as you can with enforcing least privilege and separation of duties where you can. Having good job aids and checklists so that not only do people, they have the standard, but they also have a checklist that they can follow.
Yeah.
Much like what we've seen, I believe that I read a really interesting book called The Checklist Manifesto a couple of years ago, and talks about how in medical procedures and medical services really made a big improvement in the quality of and the accuracy of the services they were providing by simply implementing checklists and making sure that everybody checked,
Yeah, that's crazy.
before starting an operation, for example. But ultimately, it's about creating a security culture. You want to try to create a culture of security where everybody feels and recognizes that it's important for the company and that they have some role to play in that. Whether they're an operator, whether they're an engineer, whether they're the CISO.
Yeah. Well, and I think the interesting thing things that you just talked about there, John, is it's not about enforcing a policy. It's about getting a level of engagement with everyone throughout the organization to realize you play a big part in this. And when we do let our guard down or we do something incorrectly, it affects everybody. That's why everyone has to play an important part of it. The other people factor that are involved in some of these risk assessments or some of these challenges for OT cybersecurity are those outside the organization, the bad guys, the hackers. Is there anything you're seeing there in terms of groups, tactics, things that we should be aware from the outside that can help us prepare better, either from defending our assets or responding to an attack?
Yeah. So we at Amexa, we don't focus too much on the activities of any one attacker group. There are companies that do, right? The threat intel companies do a great job. So whether it's Dragos or Cisco Talos or Mandiant, they have all kinds of information, including names and logos for all the threat acting groups. So we don't focus so much on that. We of course read their reports, but we do pay a lot of attention to the tactics that they're using and how they are getting into the OT environments and what are they doing when they gain access. So that's where it goes back to what I was talking about before about the recognizing that attacks can come top down, but they can also come bottom up or through side doors, and making sure. So when we do our risk assessments, either design based or greenfield or brownfield, well, we look at a particular zone or system, and we look at the what are the existing security controls that are in place that could prevent the threat actor from carrying out whatever their goal is. So we identify threats and threat actors, and we build threat scenarios, much like you would if you're doing a threat model. So we build out threat scenarios, and then we say, okay, so if this is the consequence, could it be caused by a cyber incident? First of all, in some cases, it can't, because you have other safeguards in place that are non-hackable, pressure relief valves and rupture disks and things like that. but taking those away, what is the worst case credible consequence that could be caused by a cyber event, and then look at, okay, what controls, safeguards, countermeasures, whatever term you want to use, what layers of protection do we have in place that will prevent the threat exploiting the vulnerability resulting in some bad outcome. And you kind of stack those up and you look at the effectiveness of those different layers of protection, because none of them are perfect. So that, the whole idea of defense in depth, right? You want to make sure that you've got enough layers that even if something gets through one layer, they'll get blocked by another layer of protection. So we take more of that defensive approach. Do you have enough security measures in place to prevent that unwanted outcome, or is there some way you can even change your process to eliminate that consequence from being a possibility?
No, that's an interesting perspective. So, John, this has been awesome. We've talked about a lot of different stuff in OT. Just kind of wondering, now when you look ahead, say the next 12, 18 months or so, what do you feel are some of maybe the bigger trends, bigger issues that we might be confronting?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be an easy time. This is never a boring field, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
Well,
But
you
especially
mentioned,
with
yeah,
what's going on in the world, you'd be pretty confident that we have to keep our shields up, as CISA would say, right?
yeah,
That we're going to, I think, be faced with some pretty challenging, potential for for more. Probably what I worry about is more large scale, more coordinated, more frequent attacks. So far, we've been pretty lucky. We haven't had a lot of big um, OT, high consequence OT cyber attacks. We've had them, and they're actually pretty well documented. And many, of course, many go undocumented, but uh, and the big ones that have caused problems have been documented. And I guess I'll give a shout out to. There's a really nice online database called ICS Strive, managed by a friend of mine, Greg Hale, who operates ISS Source. It's free, so you can research the known OT incidents. But what he particularly focuses on in his reporting is on those that caused physical consequences, because those are the ones we're really worried about. I think. I mean, of course, we don't want financial consequences either, but we certainly don't want health, safety, environmental, equipment damage, um, shipping off spec product, those kind of high consequence events. And what I think we might be facing coming up soon is again more frequent, better coordinated, and probably more sophisticated attacks. So um, people were asking online after the bridge incident in
yeah,
Baltimore. There were a lot of chatter around, was it a cyber event? And probably not. I guess we'll have to wait for the
yeah,
investigation to be sure, but probably not. But could a malicious actor modify the power systems, the propulsion systems, the navigational systems on a vessel? Yeah, of course,
yeah.
it's possible. So we do have to, so our critical infrastructure is something we have to make sure we protect. And so I think that's something to think about over the next 12 to 18 months. Like I said, it's not going away. Um, Regulations, I think, is the other thing to keep an eye on in the coming months and years. We've already seen in just recent years, right after the Colonial Pipeline incident, we saw a quick response by TSA on the security directives that initially they didn't get. A lot of people didn't think they got them right on the
Yeah.
first round, but after subsequent changes and revisions, I think they did settle into a pretty good place with those. And I think we'll probably see that move to other sectors.
Yeah.
We tend to regulate by sector here in the U.S. So today is pipeline, and actually we just saw executive order around maritime cybersecurity just a few weeks ago. So now maritime sector, and a lot of chatter about water. When will water security become mandated? So I think that's probably what we're going to see. I think regardless of what administration comes into effect later this year, I think the pressure on increasing our regulatory environment in the U.S. is going to continue, because we see it elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Europe and Asia and Middle East. There's a lot more cybersecurity regulations that specifically call out OT elsewhere in the world.
Well, now I may not be real popular for saying this, but I actually think the SEC guidelines that came out late last year, have actually done a ton in terms of adding some transparency to the sector and having to report these incidents and having to talk about them. I think it's helping a lot of other organizations by default just understanding what somebody else experienced and getting that
You
information.
can't ignore it, can you?
Yeah,
If you're a
exactly.
publicly traded company and you're a CISO, boy, yeah, it's something you better keep an eye on.
Well, and hopefully it opens the floodgate for resources, investment, and all those things that a lot of these enterprises need. Real quick before we go, John, you mentioned probably an influx of coordinated attacks. Do you think it's going to be focused on infrastructure? Do you think it's be focused on private industry? Combination of both? Do you have a feel of where there may be a greater emphasis by the bad guys?
Yeah. Well, I forget what they say the percentage of critical infrastructure that is operated by private industry, but it's a high percentage.
Yeah.
I forget what it is, 75, 80%, something like that. Yeah, most of our critical infrastructure is privately operated. Um, so yes, I do think that the focus is going to be critical infrastructure for two reasons. Either for for political reasons, for nation state type activity, but also it's sadly is proving to be lucrative for ransomware groups. They realize that organizations that operate critical infrastructure are desperate to get back online, and they may pay the ransom.
Yeah. Well, I think you brought up an interesting point. Now we'll kind of close things out here is we're never done. There's some people who think they're done when they implement a certain tool or put things in place, but we're not, and we know that's evolving. And I think the brighter side of this is that in the last probably 3-4 years, hopefully you agree the industrial sector has come a long way in terms of securing the enterprise, taking care of a lot of these challenges from where we are. And we are making it a lot tougher on the bad guys, I think.
We are. Yeah, we often don't give ourselves enough credit for what we've done. But I've been in the space now, as I said, 15 years, and I've seen a lot of improvement over that time. You used to have to build the case. You have to convince people it was a problem. That I don't have to do that anymore. Everybody knows it's a problem.
Absolutely. Thanks. And for more information on where John and his colleagues are up to, you can check them out at armexa.com. That's ARMEXA.com. Also like to thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For John Cusimano, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.